Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Alterra Training Podcast, where our goal is to educate and empower you to take control of your health and fitness. We are joined once again by Logan Allen with Stronghold Health and Performance. Today, we're going to be talking about overtraining and overtraining syndrome. If you guys watched the last episode, then you'll notice that today is kind of a smooth flow from that episode. So if you enjoyed the episode today, make sure that you go back and watch the most recent one before this. It's kind of a part 1 and 2, but they're also distinct episodes. So again, today talking about overtraining and overtraining syndrome. Logan, I'm just going to toss you the ball right now. I want you to go ahead and talk about kind of the theoretical backing behind training load, fatigue, recovery. So talk to me about the fitness fatigue model, and then if you remember, talk about the differences between overreaching, non-functional overreaching, overtraining, and then I'll kind of have you pass me the ball back so I can talk about overtraining syndrome.
Okay, so overtraining from a very theoretical model is doing too much, whether it's volume, intensity, frequency, any variable, doing essentially just too much in general that your body cannot recover from it, or at least cannot recover from it appropriately before the next session. So there are a few different ways to kind of but make sure we're keeping track of everything well. So some people measure HRV, which we've talked about in a previous podcast. They've measured how much DOMs you have. There's several different surveys you can have your athletes take as just a perceived readiness score. But from a very theoretical model, overtraining simply is just doing too much that you cannot adequately recover from. So every time that we train, we have a stimulus. That stimulus causes an adaptation, or at least should cause an adaptation. And while our body is adapting, we experience fatigue. So if we're kind of at baseline here, we train, our performance is going to suffer for a little bit until we can kind of super compensate and go back to above baseline. And that's kind of the whole point behind training is we train, we expect a dip, we're sore, we're fatigued. That's natural. We dip down, but the goal of training is that we're going to build back better, stronger, faster, so forth. Thus, higher than above. We do that again. Kind of like the stock market. If you're familiar with the stock market, I like this example. It's kind of ebbs and flows. It's up and down. But theoretically, if we look at the Ep.5 over the last 10 years, it's a gradual increase up. And that's exactly how we want our training to be. We expect those dips. We're not going to freak out if it dips because we know it's going to go back up. So that's kind of the fitness fatigue model. And then the next thing that Trace kind of asked about is the overreaching kind of spectrum. So overreaching is another way to kind of define overtraining, and there's a few different kind of landmark points within that spectrum. So we have normal training over here, then we have functional overreaching. So functional overreaching is where we push really hard. We know that we're going to take a little while to recover. We may acknowledge that we're going to have a little bit longer dip than normal before we super compensate. But we also program recovery in there as well. So functional overreaching can be very beneficial for athletes because it's kind of like the smart way to do it, where we push really hard, recover, push really hard, recover.
So to make this really practical for our listeners, a lot of you guys are ultra runners. You could be powerlifters, any type of athlete. The first thing that comes to mind when I think of this functional overreaching is your peak week before a race. So your peak week would be peak mileage, where probably 2 weeks, sometimes 3, sometimes 4, depending on a lot of factors. You have your highest training load, and during this week, you're not going to feel great. In fact, it's going to take probably 4 or 5 days after that week until you feel great. But the idea is you have a really, really hard training stimulus. You're also accumulating a lot of fatigue, but after that peak week, you go into your deload, and that's when your fitness continues to climb and your fatigue starts to drop down. So that functional overreaching, kind of acute short term, you're going to be more fatigued than you would like to be. However, you're still gaining fitness in that process. So as long as you have that deload for the fatigue to come down, then we are considered to be in functional overreaching.
I completely agree. That's a very practical way of putting it, is we have that functional overreaching where we are doing a lot more than normal, but we have that program recovery such as a deload so that we can recover. We don't actually go into the next step, which is non-functional overreaching. So non-functional overreaching starts the same way as functional overreaching, where we're doing too much, we can't adequately recover from it, but there's not a programmed deload. We kind of just keep doing that week on and week on. And as a result, because we cannot adequately recover, our performance declines. So instead of being at baseline, taking that dip, and super compensating above, we kind of just keep dip, 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 and kind of just going all the way down and not allowing our body to super compensate and adapt. Non-functional overreaching is kind of like the first warning sign of overtraining syndrome. So it's not full-blown overtraining syndrome yet. And hopefully most coaches will catch it at non-functional or even before non-functional overreaching. But it is that pretty severe decline, but it's not like systemic. It's not as severe as like true overtraining syndrome is.
Yeah, so to add a little bit of nuance to this, kind of the difference between non-functional overreaching and overtraining. And then don't forget, overtraining and overtraining syndrome even are not exactly synonymous. But difference between non-functional overreaching and overtraining would be the non-functional overreaching is more lack of improvement in the performance outcome. Maybe you're feeling fatigued or tired. But then when we get to overtraining, we're talking more systemic, as Logan was kind of getting to. It's not just about performance anymore. When you are really overtraining over the long term, you're going to have much more systemic fatigue, systemic issues, emotional, mental, cognitive, a whole bunch of the body systems are being affected.
Yeah. So actually, I think that's about all I had. If you want to go ahead and share what overtraining syndrome is, define it, and we'll go from there.
Yeah, so overtraining, we just laid out a spectrum. Basically, you have optimal training, where you're really like sticking to that textbook fitness fatigue model. You're giving your body a stimulus, you're going to accumulate fatigue, and then once that fatigue wears off, you're going to be able to express a higher level of fitness. So that's kind of your day-to-day. I'd say probably, at least for me, well over 3/4 of the time, the training time throughout the year, we should be in this kind of just standard workout and then recover, super compensate, workout again. And this can be viewed through multiple lenses. So for me personally, this could be like lower body strength, upper body strength, and then cardiovascular endurance. You can, of course, be in a kind of that fatigued state in multiple attributes, multiple adaptive processes, but you can still train other ones. So this is kind of that short-term, like specific attribute. So if I train legs for strength on Monday, I'm going to want to give my body a few days until I train for strength again. However, I can still do some cardiovascular endurance Monday night or Tuesday. And this is kind of what we talked about in the last episode, where when we do concurrent training, things are not going to be optimal, but as long as we understand that different systems require different times and different adaptive processes, then we can kind of modulate and titrate our dosage of exercise to figure out what our body actually needs in order to adapt to certain things. So that's kind of a long-winded way of saying that the fitness fatigue model can very much be attribute specific, but this is where we're going to spend most of our time. And then overreaching, there's probably 4 weeks out of the year where I'm truly in an overreaching state, where my fatigue is accumulating to the point where I do not feel that I'm at my best. And this is normally the 2 weeks leading up to a race where I'm both peaking for strength and endurance. So pretty high intensity and pretty high volume for strength, but also, at least for me, very high volume for running as well. So kind of the 2 weeks before each race, I normally do 2 races a year. And each race is basically a combination of a powerlifting meet a few days before the race, and the race itself. So most of the year, I am really not even touching overreaching. And then non-functional overreaching, most people, most serious athletes, specifically endurance athletes, have probably been in some level of non-functional overreaching. Really, the way that I look at this is when you're doing too much, when you're just doing more than you need to do in order to improve. So in the ultra running community, mileage and volume is king. Everybody loves to get their mileage up. Everyone loves to say, yeah, I did a 60, 70, 80 mile week last week. And while that is important for some people to get that level of volume in order to improve, most people are simply just doing too much. It's not that they can't handle it, but it's that they're not adapting to it. So if your times are not improving from the extra mileage, assuming you give yourself time to recover and super compensate, then you're just wasting your time. And then we get to overtraining, which is really where you actually start to see not only a plateau, but true decrements in performance. So this is when you're actually training too much, where you're not even recovering. So in the fitness fatigue model, you have the insult to your body, the training session, and then you have recovery, which gets you to baseline, and then super compensation is what brings you above baseline. So for non-functional overreaching, you might be getting to recovery, but you're certainly not getting to the super compensation. Whereas overtraining, you're probably not even getting back to recovery. So you're exercising and you're not even getting back to baseline. And then for overtraining syndrome, this is when you're in that long-term, time frames are rough. Probably you have to be in that state of overtraining for about 2 to 3 months to develop overtraining syndrome. And overtraining syndrome is, of course, that chronic, long-term decrement of you're just not recovering enough. You're training too much. However, we talked about a few episodes ago, is overtraining syndrome or overtraining in general really about training too much or recovering too little? To be honest, I don't think you can actually separate the two. If I had to pick one, I would absolutely say that it's because you're not recovering enough. Overtraining syndrome also is going to account for the allostatic load. If you guys were listening to the last episode, Logan talked about the funnel effect. Everything in life is a stressor in one way or the other, and everything is going to affect the organism, the body as a whole. So school, work, life, training, all of this stuff is going to act as stress and induce some level of fatigue to the body. So with a high training load, with a high allostatic load, and with low sleep and specifically low nutrition, then we're going to kind of dig ourselves deeper into a hole and develop overtraining syndrome. Do you have anything to add before I keep going?
I don't think you're covering it really well.
All right. So two main sources that I have for today's podcast are a book called Overtraining Syndromes in Athletes by Flavio Cadegiani, maybe something like that. I can't pronounce it. And then The Potential Role of Nutrition in Overtraining Syndrome, which is a narrative review by Torre et al. So for the first book, I gathered some key points, and then I'll kind of talk through these. I'm going to keep talking for another probably 5-7 minutes or so, and then Logan and I will discuss a lot of this stuff. So I'm going to throw a whole bunch of information at you, and then Logan and I will kind of flesh it out as we go. So the Overtraining Syndrome book, because of how little there actually seems to be an effect of training with respect to the prevalence of overtraining syndrome. So they found that training load is actually not very indicative of overtraining syndrome. And you can see this a lot in, Logan and I, of course, have tons of friends. Generally, my mind goes to like the ultra running community, the military community, where these individuals are training, 60 plus miles a week. I'm thinking, of course, military. If you're in Ranger school, you're going for over 2 months of really grueling training with very little food and very little sleep. So it's a miracle to me that we don't see more Ranger students, Ranger cadets develop overtraining syndrome, because they seem to have the kind of the perfect balance of everything, or the perfect potion of everything that would send somebody into overtraining syndrome. But because there's so many factors involved in overtraining syndrome, a lot of them end up being just fine. So the book kind of wants to rephrase overtraining syndrome and call it paradoxical deconditioning. So basically what they're getting at here is that these individuals who develop overtraining syndrome continue to train more and more, yet don't get fitter. So this kind of makes sense with a lot of stuff that we opened with in terms of non-functional overreaching and overtraining. So you're training more and more, you could be even training better, kind of more optimally, more volume, whatever it may be, but you're not getting fitter. In addition, there's they talk about how it's an unexplained loss of performance. So not only are you not getting better, you're actually deconditioning and losing your fitness over time, regardless of the fact that you're training more. So I'm going to go into some theories behind kind of what overtraining syndrome is, what system it affects. So this is from Torre et al. This is from the potential role of nutrition in overtraining syndrome. They do kind of just a brief description of the leading hypotheses on what overtraining syndrome actually is. The first one that they talk about is the cytokine hypothesis, which basically infers systemic inflammation is kind of the cause of whole body fatigue. Basically, really tough training is going to cause inflammation, and this inflammation is going to inhibit cellular pathways, inhibit metabolism, certainly inhibit muscle protein synthesis, because, as we talked about previous episodes, inflammation, really complicated. Some inflammation is good, but in this context, systemic chronic inflammation is actually inhibiting a lot of the cellular processes. So basically, this hypothesis says when you train too much, you are increasing inflammation and you're just never giving your body time to reduce that inflammation. And once inflammation is high, then there's really nothing to bring it down besides rest. So if you continue to exercise, you're going to continue to produce inflammation throughout the body. The next one is the glutamine hypothesis. So glutamine is an essential amino acid. It is the most prevalent amino acid in the body. You can get it through pretty much any source that you can get protein through. But it is the most common amino acid in the body. It's used for tissue development, used for basically everything. Basically, when you train too much and you consume too little glutamine, so too little protein really is the practical takeaway, then you're simply just not giving your body enough resources to rebuild. And then the next one, central fatigue theory, insufficient amino acids to generate neurotransmitters. So we look at stuff like tryptophan and a whole bunch of other amino acids that are required to actually build those neurotransmitters and other types of hormones. This is kind of similar, in my opinion, to the glutamine hypothesis. Basically, we're not giving the body enough raw materials. It's using a lot of these raw materials, but we're not replenishing these resources. Next one that they go into, the glycogen hypothesis. Again, very similar in concept to the other two. We are not giving the body enough resources to adapt, so we're putting the body in a state of low energy availability, which of course is going to impair basically every system of the body, including muscle protein synthesis, CNS energy, and then actually, of course, the process of developing neurotransmitters. Everything that we do takes energy, and glucose is the number one source of energy for these processes. And then last one, oxidative stress. Basically, when we produce too much energy oxidatively, aerobically, we are producing reactive oxygen species, and basically this is going to act very similarly to inflammation and certainly induce inflammation on its own. So all of these are kind of extreme examples. Everything that I listed can happen in a normal individual. However, these are kind of the cyclical theories that once one starts, it's going to kind of have that kind of cycle that is going to continue upon itself. In reality, there's no reason to think that any one of these actually explains overtraining syndrome. Really, all of them probably are involved in overtraining syndrome. Specifically, in my opinion, my read of the literature is certainly glycogen hypothesis is kind of the number one leading cause. Basically, individuals are not netting a positive or netting even a neutral glycogen intake, glucose intake, because they're burning so much and they're just not eating enough. Again, super multifaceted concept is overtraining. However, as we'll talk about later, kind of how to prevent it, the glycogen hypothesis is kind of the leading one in my estimation. So I'm going to go into one more little section, and then Logan and I will continue to talk about this. So back to the book by Flavio, the Overtraining Syndrome in Athletes. Here's just some kind of blood markers and some symptoms of overtraining syndrome. So athletes with overtraining syndrome have lower testosterone, lower growth hormone, and lower blood lactate accumulation. And this is important because that indicates the lack of the ability to produce energy through glycolysis. So that's kind of an insight into the low glycogen availability in the muscles. They also have increased cortisol, which is that stress hormone. This episode is not really going to be about hormones. Hormones are super complicated, and just even me saying that increases cortisol or increased cortisol is found in overtrained athletes should not make you think of anything in particular other than the fact that the body is in kind of this stressed state. Increased blood glucose, so there's higher glucose in the blood. This may indicate insulin resistance in some capacity. Increased creatine kinase, which is a measure of muscle damage. And then some really important practical ones are individuals with overtraining syndrome have decreased muscle mass and basal metabolic rate. These are big deal. Decreased sleep quality, decreased vigor, decreased libido, and then, of course, increased fatigue and increased depression, tension, anger, a whole bunch of these kind of negative emotional side effects. They also have a increased body fat percentage. So increased body fat percentage, mostly due to decreased muscle mass. And then a side note, it's really hard to kind of assess for overtraining syndrome by using weight, because when we're in a stress and inflamed environment within our actual body, we're going to hold on to a lot of water and even hold on to a lot of waste. So just stepping on the scale and weighing ourselves is not going to give a super accurate, super precise insight into our energy availability. All right, so I obviously just spit a whole bunch of information at you about overtraining syndrome. So Logan, what are your initial thoughts on all of that?
Well, I like how you really brought up the leading hypotheses, but then also kind of gave that caveat of it's probably not any one individual thing. It's probably a combination of all, 5 different hypotheses, maybe even more.
Probably more, yep.
Like we've talked about in previous podcasts, our bodies are infinitely complex. To say, oh, it's this one thing, like that's most likely not the case. Because I'd be willing to bet if you did give, so I think tryptophan was one of them, like lesser, or not enough tryptophan. If you gave someone just pure tryptophan, I do not think that would cure their overtraining syndrome. Mm-hmm. But everything works all together. Like tryptophan, I believe, is a precursor to melatonin. Mm-hmm. So, like we've alluded to in previous podcasts, again, sleeping is crucial. Getting good recovery is crucial. So, everything is all interconnected. The better we are, like, I guess, let me rephrase this. The more appropriately we're consuming calories, getting enough carbs, getting enough protein, getting enough fat, our body can adequately produce the hormones that we need, that are essential, that will help us through other areas of life. So a lot of our hormones are lipid based, so we need fat to produce a lot of these hormones. Obviously, tryptophan is a precursor to melatonin. So getting enough calories will help you in other areas as well. But I don't necessarily think we need to focus on any one specific nutrient or one specific amino acid. Rather, just focus on getting enough in general. I also really liked how we rephrased overtraining syndrome as, was it paradoxical deconditioning?
Yep.
Because that is really what it is. We start at baseline and we just keep dropping down and down further and further. And the risky part of this is a lot of really motivated athletes will be like, oh no, I'm getting worse. I'm clearly not training enough.
I gotta train harder now.
Yeah. So they'll realize, oh wow, I'm not performing as well as I was maybe a month ago. I must be backing off. I need to go run harder, faster, stronger, everything. Which will paradoxically, that'll push them even further down. So, especially in the elite athletes, the really competitive athlete roles, this can be really like, I want to say dangerous, I guess, because of that mindset of, oh, I'm doing worse, I need to go harder. I will say true overtraining syndrome most likely is not an issue if you're kind of just training for general health, you're not super competitive.
Yeah.
If you're only training like maybe 2 or 3 days a week.
Mm-hmm. I'll add to that. Even in the elite athlete realm, actually observing overtraining syndrome, even in like elite endurance athletes, is still very rare. It does happen. We definitely see a lot of non-functional overreaching and just training too much in general. However, true overtraining syndrome is very rare.
Yes. But I do think if you're not super competitive, you'll realize much sooner on the spectrum. Hopefully, functional overreaching, maybe non-functional overreaching, and not get to overtraining syndrome. But it can be a much bigger problem the more competitive that the athlete is. So if you're running an ultra but not just running it to have fun, you're running it to win, or running it to get like top 10, and you're like, oh no, I'm running slower, and you want to run faster, that's when the issues can arise. Or that also applies to strength and other roles as well.
Mm-hmm. And this is again that practical take-home message. Hopefully some of our listeners who are our mutual friends will listen and understand. Training a lot generally is fine. Like, your body is super resilient, super adaptable. As long as you're improving, I would say you're generally fine. However, in our realm, the competitive endurance athlete really likes to race very frequently, multiple times a year. And especially if you're an ultra endurance athlete, if you're doing multiple races per year and you're actually racing them, now multiple not as in like 2 or 3, but like 6 or 7 races, actual real races where you're going all out every single year, I'd say that's when this gets really concerning, because you're never really giving your body time to adapt. And this is why true athletes, professional athletes, and pretty much any realm that I can think of that includes some sort of endurance aspect will either take like an extended deload or just have like a straight up off season where they will literally do nothing except maybe some cross training for like a month or 2. And this seems just like terrifying to many endurance athletes who just want to do more and more and more. But again, it goes back to the conversation that we had last episode. If you're not adapting to your training, then you're just, I was going to say you're just wasting your time, but it can actually be much more detrimental than that. You could be wasting your time and absolutely, especially in the ultra realm, putting your health at risk and definitely cutting your career short. So racing, of course, that's great. That's why a lot of us get into it. However, going all out, I don't know, more than 6 or 8 times a year, especially if you're kind of peaking and then racing, and then you don't give your body time to kind of recover and super compensate, you go right into another peaking and racing stage, you are just simply asking for a disaster. Yeah.
A practical way of testing to make sure we are progressing and not regressing is to kind of set like a standard fitness test. So I know you have that like 4-mile run you really like to do, where it's a nice consistent track. We can go, it's 2 miles out, 2 miles back. We can push it maybe like every other month.
Yep.
It doesn't have to be super frequently, but just enough to make sure that we are progressing, we're getting better. And that we like aren't. So obviously you don't want to do that like every week, because then you're not going to have time to train either. But you want maybe like I said, every other month. That way, if we do start to regress, we can pick that up before we start reaching that like non-functional overreaching. Or if you're in the gym, that could be like a 5-rep max or something. I don't know if you necessarily want to max super frequently, but a 5-rep max is a nice easy way to still get that like benchmark test. Make sure we're still progressing and not regressing, and that way if we need to, we can take a further look at our program, be like, okay, is this too much? Maybe it's not enough. We can modify it. We can maybe look at our recovery and be like, okay, am I Am I just that fatigued? Have I accumulated that much fatigue that obviously I'm not performing as well as I could? So there's not one right or wrong answer for this, but having that baseline test does allow us to take that step back and reassess. And I'm not going to pretend there's like, okay, if you're like regressing, just like take a deload week and you'll be fine.
It's not, but you're oftentimes, and this is one of those conversations where like, if you think that you fall into the excessive training category or you think you're not training hard enough, you always feel like this is targeted at you. Absolutely, I'd say on the whole, most people actually are not training hard enough. But in our realm, especially in the ultra running community, it's always more, harder. It's just like you have to constantly push the limits. But on the whole, population as a whole, most people actually are not training hard enough, and we could, for the most part, stand to train a little bit harder.
Yeah. The problem with that is that the people that need to hear train a little less are probably going to take away that message, and the people that the people that need to train a little bit harder are going to take away the opposite message of, oh, they probably are training too much.
Yeah.
But there's not much we can do about that.
Yeah. So again, most people, I don't even know if I know anybody who has actually technically been in overtraining syndrome. However, even in the non-functional overreaching and overtraining categories, I think a big thing to look out for is your body composition. So if your weight hasn't really been changing, but you feel like you're losing muscle, gaining fat, and then of course you can get into the emotional, cognitive, vigor, libido side of all this stuff, you probably are doing too much and not recovering enough. So biggest one, easiest one to say, but hardest one to implement is to get higher quality sleep and probably more sleep. And then the nutrition side really should be, I don't feel like anybody in this day and age should actually be able to out-train what they eat, especially over the long term. So we do have some, like if somebody's really peaking for an event or doing a long duration event, of course, during maybe that peak week and the actual race day, you're going to be in a big deficit. However, on the whole, over the course of a month or more, if you're training to the point where you can't eat enough, then I can confidently say that you're training too much. So most of us can consume, digest, and absorb about 2.5 times our basal metabolic rate. So this was actually found in, they were measuring Tour de France athletes. It's Tour de France and ultra running, we always kind of joke about like it's just an eating contest, an endurance-based eating contest. And really, one of the limiters to human performance in the endurance side really is how much you can eat. So you can really only consume, somebody my body weight can consume and actually absorb around 4,000 calories per day. We might be able to bump that a little bit with proper diet, really if we're optimizing glucose and fructose. But a lot of it really is just the actual gut, the digestive system has a limit. So yes, I am actually saying if you consume 10,000 calories, you are not going to absorb and utilize and store all 10,000 of that. There are limits to our digestive system. Please don't take that to mean that you can just have a 10,000 calorie cheat day every day and you're only going to absorb 4,000 calories of that. That's just a terrible way to go. You're going to have other side effects along with that. But when we do an event like a 50K race, we're burning probably 10 to 12 times our basal metabolic rate per hour. So on that day, I would argue it's actually impossible to eat in a surplus. Now, again, those of you who are like, ooh, weight loss hack, run an ultra every day, you're going to run into overtraining. That's not a good approach. However, when we look at kind of the nutritional and training side, as long as we kind of balance our training, we don't train too much. And this is one reason why I'm so opposed to like those 80, 100, 120 mile training sessions, training miles per week for a lot of people. It's just because I know that you simply cannot absorb the nutrients that are required to recover from that. So again, I'll throw out those numbers again. It seems like we can only absorb about 2.5 times our basal metabolic rate. So if my basal metabolic rate, I weigh about 200 pounds, we'll just say my BMR is 1,500. calories. That's just how many calories it takes to basically keep the lights on in my body, not exercising, none of that. That means I could consume and absorb theoretically around 3,800, maybe 4,000 calories in a day. And if I'm running an ultra, I'm probably going to burn about that much, but that's only going to take about 8 hours of the day. So the other 16 hours of the day, I'm also burning calories. So on that day, regardless of how much I eat, I'm still in a deficit of about 2,000 calories or so. Obviously, these are rough numbers. Really, the whole point of this is to show that you absolutely can train, especially over the long term, train too much to the point where it doesn't matter how much you eat, you simply will not be able to refuel. So Logan, give me kind of your thoughts on that. And then I know that you've done some research into sleep strategies, tactics. Tell us kind of some practical takeaways for that.
Yeah, so I completely, like Trey said, it's really hard to eat enough on a day where you've ran an ultra. Also, if you're running that far, you just don't feel necessarily great afterwards. You don't really want to eat. Most of the time after Promised Land in April, I'm kind of forcing food down after the race. I'm looking at all this food and nothing looks appetizing. I kind of feel nauseous. I don't want to eat, but I know I need calories. But once again, that's not a weight loss hack. So please don't interpret it as such.
We have friends that do interpret it as such, by the way.
Yeah. That being said, though, I lost my train of thought, actually. Nutrition is very important. It will be hard to eat enough on those days. But you can also kind of take that for the next couple weeks and be I can eat whatever I want. And that's also probably not the best mindset either. But if overtraining is kind of potentially an issue for you, I think eating more is almost always better, at least more quality foods. So not a ton of just empty calories that would cause you to gain weight and you wouldn't actually benefit from them, but more nutrient-dense, healthy foods that will allow you to adequately recover and give your body the building blocks that they need to rebuild and repair muscle and tissue, give you the ability to synthesize various hormones that are dependent on the food that we consume, as well as just give you enough calories to refuel and build back up our energy reserves and the glycogen within our muscles.
Yeah, and while Logan said it, carbohydrate intake is huge in this aspect. I think a lot of people, especially the gym bros, when they think recovery, they think of protein. But if you had to choose one macronutrient for recovery, it would be carbs, absolutely, basically every time. Now, fortunately, we don't have to choose. I really like the NSCA. They recommend, a 3 or 4 to 1 carb to protein intake for post-workout. So maybe 80 grams of carbs, 20 grams of protein post-workout. I think that's very practical, but it also shows the importance of carbohydrates. Muscle protein synthesis is not the only thing that matters with recovery. Glycogen resynthesis, obviously super important, but glucose is involved in, basically every recovery and performance pathway, at least that I can think of. So these low-carb fanatics, they're holding themselves back.
Yeah, we store about 2,000 calories worth of glycogen or blood sugar within our body. And like Trey said earlier, we're burning a lot more than 2,000 calories during an ultra race or any real endurance event. Even a marathon, you're burning more than 2,000 calories. And if we fully deplete, not that we will fully deplete, but if we get close to fully depleting our glycogen, we really need to refuel that, or else we're just going to feel not good. And that's one reason a lot of marathoners hit a wall around mile 20, because that's about how many calories we have stored to get us through mile 20, and the rest of it is we're kind of burning fat, we're moving fuel around, we're hopefully consuming something to replenish our blood sugar so that we can get more sugar into the muscles. But yeah, I completely agree. Carbohydrates are very important for recovery. So is protein. I don't know if I could really say one is more important than the other. But like Trey said, thankfully we live in a world where we don't have to choose. Both are very important. I also want to say getting fat is also important. There's a lot of people that are very, very pro like low fat or no fat diets. And while having excess fat in our diet probably is not a good thing for long-term health, having a little bit of fat is very important for, once again, synthesizing hormones, making sure we are adequately recovering well.
Yep, and that's generally over the long term, whether it's like not necessarily race day, because race day, if you consume too much fat, it's going to slow down digestion. But what Logan's talking about here is we have protein as the building blocks, and then we have glucose as kind of the energy source. And those are really the two macros that we think about with respect to sports nutrition. However, from the health side, yes, from the sports nutrition side a little bit. However, it's not really something that you should focus on too much. Logan's just kind of saying, don't forget about fat. Fat, obviously, is going to help transport fat-soluble vitamins, help develop hormones. Fat, cholesterol is part of basically all of our cells. It adds structure as well. Protein is not the only thing that has structure in our bodies. However, from the sports nutrition side, protein should definitely not be undervalued. And protein is uniquely important over the long term because of the amino acids' role in neurotransmitter basically construction. Same thing with hormones. So really we do need all three macronutrients. However, like race day nutrition, again, we're talking about overtraining in this episode, but race day nutrition, since we've talked so much about racing, don't force fat down, especially if it's like a shorter race, a race that takes 1 day or less, which I don't know if that's shorter for the listeners, but a race that doesn't take days and weeks. Probably don't force yourself to eat fat because that will kind of slow down overall digestion. And also don't be misled by a lot of the Instagram influencers and social media influencers that try to get you to buy into the fact that if you can train yourself to burn more fat, then you don't need carbohydrates. So we absolutely can train ourselves to burn a higher percentage of fat at a specific intensity. However, carbohydrates are always going to be the king fuel source in exercise and in recovery. So don't buy into, and Logan might have a different opinion on this. I kind of hope he does because I'd love to learn the ketone IQ shot things. I think it's medium chain triglycerides. What's ketones? But that, in my opinion, is not actually a good fuel source for exercise. It's at least not better than carbohydrates. So don't buy too much into the aspect of I'm a fat adapted athlete. I don't need carbs.
I need to refresh myself in the literature surrounding like some of the ketones. It's been a minute since I've looked at that. But I completely agree that you're going to feel better consuming carbs during a long distance event than trying to rely on ketones. You're going to, just point blank, you're going to feel better. There's not really a better way for me to say that. And I think mid-race, we should be focusing on getting as many carbs as we can. And I also agree we probably shouldn't be focusing on getting fat, or I would even argue we really don't need to focus on getting protein during the event itself. We really just need to be replacing our carbs. That being said, we shouldn't necessarily, you don't have to avoid protein and fat, but I want you to focus on carbs. So, that's one of the reasons so many aid stations at marathons, ultra marathons have fruit and candy. I know there's always gummy bears and grapes and whatnot. And there's a reason for that, is that carbs make people feel good when they're running. It's a very quick, very efficient energy source. And yeah, if we fully deplete ourselves, we're not going to feel great. I think even leading up to the race, that's why a lot of endurance athletes do a carb load. I don't necessarily think that most people need to do a carb load. But, I off topic, but I remember in cross country we were doing carb loads back in the day. It was we run 3 miles. We're not going to deplete our glycogen.
All you did was give yourself a stomach ache.
Yeah, for real. But that was off topic. You're not going to burn your glycogen in 3 miles. Once again, you have like 2,000 calories stored that can get you roughly 20 miles. So carb loading for most people is not essential. Even in ultra endurance athletes where you are going further than how many like carbs you have, we're going to have carbs along the race as well.
Yeah, and you're burning a lower percentage of carbs.
Exactly. But also it might help you as well to get different forms of carbs. So one thing I really like to do is eat some potatoes, get some starch as well as some of those like quicker digesting carbs. I'll take like a handful of gummy bears and a potato and I'll go about my day. And but that personally helps me. I don't know if there's any actually like literature on consuming various types of carbs during a race.
There's definitely literature on like in the sports replacement drink, goos, whatever it may be. Having about a 3-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose is really beneficial because that glucose is going to go through specific glucose transporters through the gut to get into the bloodstream, whereas the fructose actually takes a different pathway to get in to the liver and then is released from the liver into the bloodstream. So you can actually optimize blood glucose and therefore muscle glucose and therefore performance if you do kind of mix up your carbohydrates. Again, a 3-to-1 ratio of glucose to fructose in that really controlled sports science setting seems to be beneficial. However, what Logan's saying also makes sense. The way that I would think about it is the gummy bears, that's going to digest really quickly, get into the bloodstream within, seconds to minutes. Whereas the potato is going to take a little bit longer to digest, so he's going to be able to burn those gummy bears. And then by the time he's used the sugar from those gummy bears, the potato is going to be turned into glucose through the breakdown through digestion. And then that's going to enter the bloodstream, as far as I'm aware, through basically the same transporters as the glucose. Because all carbs that we consume, by the time they're used in our muscles, they're either converted to glucose or converted to glucose and then converted to fat and then stored. So yeah, I could definitely see from like the timing and kind of glucose drip aspect how gummy bears and potatoes would give you that immediate energy and kind of the prolonged glucose drip into the bloodstream.
Yeah. Like, I fully admit it may be a placebo effect. I feel great when I do something like that.
And you feel more full from potatoes.
Yeah.
That's huge.
So, I don't know whether or not I actually get a benefit from it. Who knows? I think I do. Once again, might be placebo. Who knows? But we'll take what we can get. The other thing that is slightly off topic, but slightly on topic, but during a ultra endurance race, caffeine can also be really beneficial to people. One, just because caffeine gives you a little bit of energy, gives you that nice boost, makes you a little bit more alert, which is also nice if you're feeling kind of tired, fatigued. That can kind of help alleviate some of those symptoms. Another cool kind of benefit of caffeine is that it helps increase the rate of lipolysis, or the rate at which we burn fat. So during a race where we want to consume a little bit more of our carbohydrate and our carb stores, like glycogen within our muscle, consuming more caffeine can help shift a great or more percentage of that burning to fat rather than like more carbs. I wouldn't know, maybe not more fat than carbs, but it can help shift that ratio a little bit more towards fat.
Yeah, so
I think a good way to describe it.
So caffeine helps release fat from your adipose tissue. We just know that when we take caffeine, we see more fat in the blood, different components of fat as well. I think, as far as I'm aware, I know that I've seen mixed results in terms of if caffeine actually helps you burn a higher percentage of fat. But I think the theory is sound. We release fat from adipocytes. Theoretically, our muscles will take that and burn that fat instead of carbohydrates. Again, we've absolutely seen that blood markers of fat go up after caffeine, which is generally a good thing. However, I've seen what I believe to be stronger evidence to show that if you have carbohydrates and if your intensity is high enough, you're still going to preferentially burn carbohydrates. This is going to be tough in the ultra realm, though, because we are at a lower intensity, 60 to 70% of VO2 max, to where theoretically we could, assuming we kind of have that time, a low enough intensity, we could burn more fat. So Logan is absolutely not wrong in this circumstance. It's just we haven't seen actual studies on long duration endurance events. It's absolutely going to be intensity dependent. However, to his main point, caffeine just makes you feel better. And any of you guys who have done a long duration endurance event, you know that just the way you feel, regardless of if you actually have more cellular energy or you're hydrated or not, just the way that you feel makes a world of difference.
Well, one last little caveat that reminded me again, it just jogged my memory and then we'll move on, is electrolytes are also crucial for these long events. They also help you retain more water, which when we are doing some of these long distance events, dehydration as well as hyponatremia can be, which is low blood sodium levels, can be very detrimental. So not only consuming enough carbs, enough electrolytes, not enough carbs, enough water, but also making sure we're getting electrolytes, whether that's like sodium, potassium, whatever. Sodium is probably the most important in this scenario due to the fact that we're sweating it out. And as long as, if it's a hot event especially, we're going to be sweating out a lot of sodium. Mm-hmm. So we're making sure we're replacing that. It doesn't necessarily have to be with like an electrolyte beverage. We could be eating some salty foods at the aid station. So like a lot of ultra marathons have like potato chips and I'm blanking other salty foods now, like pretzels. Mm-hmm. So if you prefer one or the other, that's great. But trying to get at least one of those options to either replace your salt from food or liquids can be very beneficial as well.
Mm-hmm. And one of the references that I addressed earlier, which we'll put in the description, did say that markers of dehydration were also higher in individuals with overtraining syndrome. So this could indicate either that these individuals are not hydrating enough or that they basically cannot get hydrated because of other aspects involved in overtraining syndrome. And as Logan alluded to, the relationship between water, electrolytes, and carbohydrates is intricate. They all kind of rely on each other to keep their storage up. So for example, if you're trying to rehydrate with water and electrolytes, it's ideal to have carbohydrates. And with that, it's actually going to help you get that water and electrolytes into the bloodstream faster. And there are, of course, other mechanisms downstream in the muscles, in the urinary tract as well, that all three of these different types of nutrients, as well as everything, right? We already discussed how the body is infinitely intricate, and what we know now is we're really just seeing snapshots of individual systems. And arguably, if you look at the literature, even if you look at kind of the theories that I talked about behind overtraining syndrome, you look at the structure of science in the past, and it's always been looking at this one specific thing. We're studying this, and this, and we're trying to piece it together. Whereas we're kind of only recently getting enough information to look at the body as a whole organism. So all that to say, that water, electrolytes, carbohydrates are all critical, not only for race day nutrition performance, but also to prevent overtraining syndrome as well. All right, unless you have something else to add. You have something to add?
No, I was going to say, want to get into sleep?
Yes, exactly. Yep.
Cool. So when we talk about sleep, the common term for like sleep tips and everything is sleep hygiene. I don't necessarily know why they called it that, but that's the term for it. So when we're discussing sleep hygiene and methods of improving your sleep, there are a few things that we can do that help a lot, and there's some things that we can do that might help less. And I think for the vast majority of people, it'd probably be better for them to stay away from like pharmacology until it's needed. I think a lot of people hop towards melatonin or something along those lines very, very quick, when in reality maybe they just need to modify a different variable and they would have had the same effect, rather than taking like an exogenous form of some sort of medicine. So first of all, we want our bedroom to be relatively cool. I think most literature shows it should be about 67 degrees Fahrenheit, which I am not sure what that is in Celsius.
I don't know.
But I think most of our listeners are American, so we'll use the freedom units. So keeping the bedroom around 67 degrees, keeping it dark is also very good. We shouldn't have too much light. So if you live in an area where it is bright outside, maybe there's a street light, maybe there's a building across that constantly has the lights on, getting blackout curtains can be very beneficial, or wearing something like an eye mask can also be good. So keep the room cool, keep it dark, avoiding bright lights before bed can also be very good, very beneficial, as well as specifically avoiding like the high frequency lights, so like the blues and like purples. So a lot of phones and devices now have a feature where those kind of turn like more red at night. That can be very beneficial. Make sure we have that feature turned on our laptops or TVs or phones. It can also be beneficial just to kind of turn off all the tech before bed. That way we're not, one, getting those bright lights, getting those blue lights, but also not receiving that like mental stimulus that can maybe stress us out. Maybe we'll think about something. We can kind of be nice and relaxed to go to bed. And there's a ton of different things that we can really get into in terms of sleep hygiene. I think those are probably the most important. Mm-hmm. You can also turn off overhead lights. So overhead lights kind of activate a certain part of our eye that go to our brain that signal it's daytime. So turning off overhead lights, maybe turn on some lamps, keeping the lamps low on the ground, can activate different parts of the eyes. They'll be like, oh, it's bedtime, the sun is down. We can eat a meal, about, I think, meal 3 to 4 hours before bed that has lots of protein, carbs, and good amount of fat. That way we feel full, we're ready to sleep. Everyone knows that like that post-lunch, like nap time, same thing, but for dinner, we can do the same thing. So we can also make sure we're hydrated. Hydrating is very important for sleep. However, caveat to that is we don't want to overhydrate. So a good thing to do is consuming some electrolytes before bed as well, because electrolytes will help us retain more water, because we don't want to disrupt our sleep by having to wake up to go to the restroom in the middle of the night. So I was actually reading a interesting study about this the other day that was looking at milk consumption before bed, because milk has fat, carbs, and protein, as well as electrolytes in it. And they found that people slept a lot better when they did consume a glass of milk before bed, because it helped make sure they had the nutrients that they needed, like vitamin D, calcium, protein, fats, carbs, like I just said, as well as some like sodium and potassium that helped them retain water, make sure they were adequately hydrated throughout the night. That being said, if you're lactose intolerant, that might not work, but it could be a good thing to try. Mm-hmm. And I'll pass it over to you.
I love it.
No, that was a mouthful.
Some of the last few points that Logan brought up are what I want to touch on. So you do want to be hydrated before you go to bed. However, of course, you don't want to have to wake up to pee 3 or 4 times a night. If you do have to get up to go pee multiple times a night, definitely drink less before bed. Probably getting up once is fine. Even twice can be pretty disruptive, but you kind of have a give and take there, because you of course want to stay hydrated. Kind of one of those things that we hear all the time, but a lot of us kind of fail to actually execute, is when you're drinking water, make sure that you just kind of sip it slowly. Of course, there are exceptions to this, but the faster that we consume water and the faster that our blood plasma rises, the more we're going to have to urinate. So basically, it's kind of the rate of change of the blood plasma. If we chug water and our plasma volume increases by 5%, then we're going to have to urinate sooner. Whereas if we just kind of slowly sip it, and it increases 2 or 3% over the course of an hour, then we're more likely to retain that water. And as Logan said, electrolytes can help with this. So I oftentimes wake up twice to go to the bathroom during the night, and that's generally because I drink too much water before bed. I oftentimes wake up with a dry throat, dry nose, so I try to drink a lot of water to offset that. However, that kind of ends up backfiring. On the other hand, my wife, she wakes up around 4 or 5 every morning. That's just when she gets up. And some of that, whether it's conscious or not, I believe is because she's hungry. She's got a lot of muscle. She eats a lot, but also she kind of wakes up and first thing that she does is normally gets some protein, gets a snack. And I can tell when she eats a snack just before bed, she might be able to sleep in until 5 or 5:30. So kind of that, I actually am really interested by that study that Logan brought up about drinking milk, because that's of course going to satisfy your hydration status, but it's also going to top off the blood lipids, blood amino acids, and then blood glucose even to a certain extent. And that's going to push back, of course, your hunger signals, and hopefully going to allow you to sleep in and sleep a little bit more soundly. So without reading that study, that actually makes a ton of sense to me. You get that hydration and nutrition in kind of last thing before bed, but it's not a big heavy meal. It doesn't upset your stomach unless, of course, you're lactose intolerant. But it's not like eating a big carb heavy meal. Not that carbs before bed are bad, but yeah, I'm definitely going to start trying that, because I've always, the past, year and a half, I've done Greek yogurt with peanut butter and honey and blueberries before bed, but then drink a decent bit of water alongside that. So I might just replace that for milk and kind of see how that does in terms of total fluid intake and nutrition. Sleep is really complicated. I would tell you to kind of get a sleep monitor, but there are a lot of people for whom that backfires. They end up just obsessing over how they sleep. If they don't sleep well, it throws off their whole day. I am one of those people. I don't look at my sleep status until like the afternoon. So like in a couple hours, I'll look at how I slept last night. But if I looked at it this morning and I saw my sleep score was 65, then I would just subconsciously trick myself into thinking that I slept terribly last night. So I actually generally don't encourage people to monitor their sleep for that reason that I just said, but also because it's not super accurate. All right, I'm going to kind of give a recap of the episode that we did today, and I'll let Logan have the closing remarks. So overtraining and overtraining syndrome. We have this spectrum. The framework is the fitness fatigue model. As we train, we develop fatigue, but we also hopefully increase fitness as that fatigue goes down and as we supercompensate. During stages of overreaching, our fatigue might kind of predominate the way that we feel. However, we're still getting fitter through this time of overreaching. And as long as our fatigue comes down, then our fitness will be able to show itself. Non-functional overreaching is where we are training hard, but we're not really allowing ourselves to supercompensate. We might be recovering to the point where we can maintain output, but we're not getting fitter. Overtraining is training too much to the point where we're not even getting back to recovery. And then overtraining syndrome is long-term. Again, the literature is kind of undecisive on this. It probably takes about 2 to 3 months of overtraining to develop overtraining syndrome. And you can think of overtraining syndrome as a much more systemic, whole body, fatigued state that is generally a result of, yes, training too much, but more likely just not consuming enough food, specifically carbohydrates, yes, protein, and then as we talked about, fat is also important as well. And then micronutrients, of course, very important. The electrolytes, magnesium seems to be a big one for overtraining syndrome as well. And then, other micronutrients as well. Vitamin D was also a big one on here. Decreased hydration, increased muscles, markers of muscle damage, increased stress hormones, decreased anabolic hormones, decreased muscle mass, reduced kind of impaired body composition, so that reduced muscle mass with increased fat. Sometimes the body weight decreases, sometimes it doesn't. It is important to, if your body weight is kind of plateauing, or is at a plateau, but you feel like you're gaining fat, definitely even stepping on something like an InBody. It doesn't have to be a super accurate body composition analysis, but kind of something to give you insight to see if you actually are losing muscle and gaining fat can be very useful here. Because if you're just looking in the mirror, it's so subjective, it's kind of hard to tell, especially on that day-to-day, week-to-week basis. And then from nutrition, Yeah, really. I mean, you can look at overtraining syndrome through a few different lenses. In my opinion, it's kind of this long-term deficit of nutrition and sleep. I suspect it's actually probably a little bit more on the nutrition side than the sleep side. But that, as far as I'm aware, is certainly up for debate. Sleep, obviously, super important, especially for the cognitive, mental side, in addition to the physical side. So hopefully that was a good recap. Logan, you got any closing remarks?
Well, I think that was a great recap. Once again, we'll post this on Spotify, on Alterra Training Podcast, and on YouTube for the Stronghold Health and Performance. And we'll link the book, the book and the article that Trace brought up, and I will also link the sleep hygiene study that I was referencing with the milk as well in the bottom there. If anyone wants to give it a read, it was pretty interesting.
Awesome. Yep. Like, subscribe. Don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions, give recommendations for future podcasts, whatever it may be. Thanks, guys.